Hey folks, in this interview, it's all about underwater photography with my friend, Mr. Craig Stampfli. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Behind the Scene, a podcast from Skyloom. Today we're going to be talking about underwater photography with a friend of mine from down under, ironically, Craig Stampfli. Craig, welcome to the show, man. How's it going?
G'day, Frederick. Very good, mate. Yourself?
I'm doing really good. I am doing really good. I'm excited to talk about this topic with you because there's a lot of unknowns that goes along with this, and I think a lot of people that are interested in doing underwater photography don't participate in underwater photography because there's a lot of danger, perceived or real. There's a lot of logistics around underwater versus just going out and saying, you know what, I'm going to take a picture of this person. We're going to talk about all that stuff. Before we dive into it, I want to get some background on you. So Craig Stampfli, the photographer, I hinted that you are down under, right? Where are you located, and kind of what's the miniature origin story for Craig Stampfli?
Okay, I'm based in Brisbane, Australia, so that's on the east coast, about 1,000 kilometres north of Sydney, and near the Barrier Reef, which is sort of an interest of why I wanted to get into a little bit of underwater photography. Yeah. Day by day, my day job is a commercial photographer, typically doing a lot of real estate, but headshots, product photography, events, the odd wedding, things like that.
Nice.
And then I've added underwater photography as one of the things I like to do for a bit of fun, and slowly turning it into a bit of an income generator.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear about that because so just you're just to put a finer point on it, you're a full-time photographer. You make your living. Correct. And pay taxes on income from photography, right?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
So then, and then now you're saying that you for fun you're doing underwater stuff, but you're slowly starting to monetize that. Talk about that a little bit. Just the before we dive into the nuts and bolts of underwater photography, talk a little bit about the monetization side of it. Is it possible to monetize that? It seems like a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. It's not a big core income stream for me. I do it for fun and as a hobby and learning from it and getting the opportunity to add to my portfolio in terms of images that people typically don't take. There's other underwater photographers that are substantially better than I am, but I'm hoping I do something a little bit differently in terms of how I shoot models or clients or, a pregnant mother or something like that. So for me, it's to break out from my day-to-day, have a bit of fun, and hopefully stand out in terms of taking a different image.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Right there, it's standing out in a crowd of increasingly good photography that we see on on Instagram and everything. It's interesting because they say the rising tide raises all ships, right? And as the level the level of good work rises, it means you have to up your game and do things different. But are you Craig? Are you doing things differently just for the sake of differentiating yourself, or are you just like, I love underwater and I want to shoot more of that genre?
I love underwater. I want to shoot more of that genre, and I'm looking a little bit at what people do and how they do things, and either it doesn't gel with me, how I don't particularly care for that style, or I want to stand out and actually quite often I'll show the environment that I'm shooting in. You see quite a lot of photos that there's a very dark background. It's a very flowing dress on a model or something like that. And I've stayed away from that. I'm quite happy to show a swimming pool or the depth of, a fairy pool up in Noosa or something like that where possible. I want to include some of the environment in my image.
I love that. So let's dive into the kind of the nuts and bolts. I want to focus the majority of this interview or this discussion on the how-tos, not necessarily a how-to guide, but just kind of your learnings along the way. I know you've probably made some mistakes and some successes, and you're still here. So far. You're still here, so you haven't electrocuted yourself by dropping lights into the pool or anyone else. So how does that flow, like from soup to nuts, from when you're just starting and you're like, okay, I have this idea in my head for an underwater shot, I want to do that. Does it start like that from like a germ of an idea, or is it just like, hey, model, let's get in the water and see what comes of it. What's your planning process?
It's a bit of both. For models or clients that I haven't worked with before, it's typically something new for them. I'm obviously used to it now. I've been working underwater for a few years. With a model or a client, you've got to try and help train them to, how to, hold their breath or breathe out, how to put their, not to swell up their face with like a chipmunk. Mm-hmm. So the initial probably first 15, 20 minutes is just getting them relaxed, and then just trying a few poses underwater and getting them comfortable with maybe a bit of water going up their nose or something like that. I've found that typically models that have got a dance background, they're more in tune with how their body sort of works. They know where their hands are, their feet are, they can point their toes, and it looks very, very graceful underwater. Yeah. You get somebody who's never really done it before, and it's all limbs going everywhere, and they're struggling, but that's all part of the exercise. Yeah. And I may get less photos that I could work with, but that's fine. It's all part of the exercise of getting them used to that environment. And I've had repeat customers who have never done it before, who've done it once with me, that want to come back and try it again.
That's you see that hump seems like that's the hump to get over. Like if you want to do a shot, finding someone. Well, first of all, finding a location. I think you're fortunate enough to have a pool at your property, right? So you can do it there, but I would argue most people don't, right? So where do they shoot it? And especially if there's you need the body of water to shoot in, and then you need to find the model that's willing to get into that body of water and hold his or her breath underwater. And then, if it's a public location, what if there's a little nudity? How do you handle that? What do you say to those photographers that are interested in experimenting in this genre, but those kinds of barriers are the ones that are keeping them from it? Should they just say, you know what, let me wait until I, can get a pool in my backyard, then I'll try it? Or should they just go for it now?
I'll go for it now. Yeah, I mean, there's no point putting it off, because who knows what's going to happen, tomorrow. If you've got the means to do it safely and, not waste a lot of money, then by all means, I would suggest give it a go. You can get inexpensive cases for your mobile phone. That's probably the first one I tried. Was I had an old iPhone, and I bought a little case, and I tried that underwater, and I thought it was pretty cool. And then that evolved to the housing that I have now for one of my cameras. And I've just recently bought a new little Micro Four Thirds system, and I'm looking at housings for that, just because it's smaller and lighter and gives me another option. Yeah. I think you need to understand that electronics and water typically don't work very well together. Mm-hmm. So as long as you're prepared for, either drowning a camera or damaging a phone, it's not going to be the end of the world. But, maybe it's your backup camera that you want to get a housing for or something like that. Yeah. Certainly the camera that I had that drowned in my backyard pool thankfully was my backup camera. And that's the one I was willing to risk as I sort of learnt the initial stages of how things work underwater and how to work underwater. Yeah. Even in a small backyard pool.
Every time I talk to you, I want to go shoot underwater photography. You make it sound easy. You're like, oh, just put a housing on there, get under there and shoot. But it's not, right? I mean, there's lighting considerations, because the light is different. It's diffracted under there. Different. The color shift. Like, talk about those like technical challenges.
So with the lighting, typically I do most of my work during the day when I'm using a lot of natural light. I have a good idea of when my pool's in shadow and when it's not in shadow, and work with those shadows at times during summer. I've started to introduce underwater LED lights, so they're not strobes. I'm using constant lights, and they're just a very bright underwater spread beam torch. I've got 3 of them now. I can either sit them on the pool and move them around, or I'll put them on light stands, or hang them in the water, depending on the effect that I'm after. Mm-hmm. And again, a lot of this is just sort of trial and error, trying different things, just sort of thinking about where I want the light, and then working with it.
Does the light itself underwater, like what are the characteristics? I know that obviously the deeper you go, the more colors we lose, etc.
You lose your red.
You lose your red.
You lose a lot of the red channel. Mm-hmm. What I've found is, even in my pool, which is about 6 foot deep, the deepest, is I can add a nice LED light at the bottom, a torch, and a flashlight, and that'll actually help bring back some of that light that I need. It helps a lot with my color balance. So I've been using lights just to help improve just color balance in general. That's been a big one for me over the last probably 2 years now, just slowly adding a light here or there and just finding what it can do. I did a night shoot late last year or early this year, and so it was well after dark, and I used two torches or two lights, one with a red channel on and one with white, and just a white light, and got some really good effects for that.
Yeah,
I was really happy with working with that model.
What does it look like in terms of exposure differences underwater, or does it matter because you're just metering at the camera, or in other words, does the inverse square law apply when you're submerged?
It probably does. I guess it depends on how much light you're throwing at it. I found that you do have to have the lights quite bright, which for the model is awkward to look at times. So you've got to be conscious of that.
Yeah.
I've never measured the inverse square law for the lights. That's probably a good challenge for over summer when I can actually jump in there and maybe set up some scales or things like that. But more light tends to be good in terms of just illuminating the subject, getting a good focus. I have found that I quite like sometimes in the shadows, you can get a nice effect that way. You can still show depth. You can still show some movement in the water, even a slow shutter speed with the flowing of a dress or hands works quite well. So it's not always tack sharp. That sort of mystery is quite nice at times. But for the most times, you want a sort of good shutter speed to sort of, freeze that person. It looks like they're either floating in midair or floating in mid-water. Slowly introducing some props and things like that for people to play with and look at and interact with. And that sort of helps as well, rather than just a person always sort of looking over their shoulder or looking at me.
Yeah,
so
we could do
it's slowly evolving.
The bewildered mermaid look, right? Under
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what it reminds me of? Do you remember that movie 300? You remember that? Have you ever seen? Tell me you've seen 300. Gerard Butler was in the lead.
Oh yeah, the Spartans thing.
Yeah, the Spartans. Yeah, this is Sparta. Yeah, that one.
So guy, yeah.
Yeah. You remember that one scene where he climbs up the mountain to talk to the sages or whatever, and there's this one scene with this woman who is, I guess, can pretend the future or whatever, but she's dancing and undulating, and you look at the behind the scenes for that, as I normally do for these movies, and that was obviously that was shot underwater, right? But it doesn't look like it just looks like she's floating in air, but somehow the fabric is flowing and all that. Whenever I see your work, I think of that shot. I think of that shot because it's very cool. So you have to go rewatch that.
I'll rewatch that. That'll be my. I've got nothing on today, so rather than doing some paper,
rewatch it for that scene. I want to. You got to send me a picture. Text me a picture of that scene.
Will do.
Yeah, but that's cool though. So even looking at that scene, when the producers of that show or the director or whomever, the writers came up with that particular person, that character in the movie, I'm wondering how do you concept a shot like that? Knowing, like, do you pre-visualize? Well, we know the water is going to look like this, and we want this kind of color, so we need these gels. Is it the same kind of flow? Yeah, is it the same flow that you'd have on a, just a regular above ground shoot where you're just kind of putting it all together, or does more go into it because there's like with safety and underwater divers just in case she takes a breath and she like how does it? How do you get to that level of just having everything nailed so you as the artist can just concentrate on getting the shot?
With something like with the Sparta shot or the 300 shot, I would imagine that she would be quite buoyant, so she would most likely be tethered, so they can keep her in one spot. So the safety aspect is would be over the top. So, but yes, it would be divers, it would be giving her oxygen and things like that. Yeah. And then obviously when they go to film, take it away. So that whole thing, that's part of what I discuss with clients. Before we get in the pool, I try to make it a little bit lighthearted because quite often, people are a little bit nervous about getting into the pool. I will start saying that most of my work, people have approached me. They've either seen my work and they'll contact me and they want to do something underwater with me. And quite often, it's great when they say, and how much do you charge? That's a good one for me. But quite often it's, people have either seen my posts on Instagram or Facebook. And that's how I find clients. That's how they come to me.
That's cool.
But sorry, back to 300. It would be substantially more evolved and elaborate than what I do in my pool. or wherever I happen to be.
But you're safe though when you're shooting. Yeah, you're safe, and what safety precautions do you take? I mean, I'm assuming. Well, I don't want to assume. Have you ever tethered a model to the bottom of the pool to photograph her?
No,
not yet.
If anything,
not yet.
Not yet. There's always a not yet. If anything, I've had to add weights to models, and I've looked at ways of doing that without making it look too bulky or too unsafe. Me personally, I wear a mask and a weighted vest. I used to use a typical diving weight belt, but I found that a little bit uncomfortable, and now I've got one of those. Essentially, it's an exercising vest that you can add weights to, and I just put that on and off I go. In my pool, I can stand up anywhere in my pool, and I'm fine. So I can stand up anywhere. With models, normally we need to tell them to breathe out and then go down, do the pose that we've discussed, do whatever we're going to do, the movement, and then they can pop back up. Typically, the way I explain it is we'll work on a pose. Once they're ready, I'll go down, and then I say, look, just give me 2 or 3 seconds to get into position, whether it's lying on the bottom of the pool looking up, or sort of on my knees or on my side, or wherever it happens to be, and then they can come down, and hopefully they can do the pose that we've discussed within reason. Typically, you'll do it several times until you get it right where possible. And then when they come up, I come up. And typically, as they're coming up, I'm following up and sort of trying to get a tighter shot. And that's where often I've gotten the reflections, because it's very unplanned. They're typically, heads tilted back up, and I'm following up a person as they come and break the surface, and you get some nice bubbles and some reflections and things like that. So typically underwater, I'm shooting quite a lot, shooting a lot more than I would normally above water.
What does that look like in terms of the duration? So you said a couple seconds, you tell the model that, okay, give me a couple seconds to get down underwater, snap, snap, snap. And then presumably people can't hold their breath that long. And then you're up breathing and then back down. How many cycles do you?
Typically we'll do, I'll go down, snap, snap, snap. And that's probably 10 to 15 seconds, depending on the model. The fitter ones, or the ones that are more comfortable underwater, typically can go a little bit longer. And then it's very rare that they out-breathe me, because typically they're also breathing out, whereas I'm normally breathing in, so I'm a little bit more prepared. But yeah, probably 15 to 20 seconds maximum, I would say. And then we'll come up. I'll have a quick look at the back of the photos. If there's anything that I think that that looks really good, they'll have a look in the back of the screen. And then we'll discuss, and let's try it again, or let's try this now, or I'm going to go on that side, or I want you in the middle. So there's a lot of, it's difficult to say. It's not a lot of planning involved. There's a couple of sort of set shots that I like to take. I always like to take just a typical sort of portrait, just go down on your knees, and I'm going to be right in front of you. I'm just going to take a simple headshot. Yeah. Because most people don't have a headshot underwater.
Yeah,
so
I don't.
I try to do that as well. Yeah, well, next time we catch up.
There you go.
But, so I do like to make it a little bit interesting for them. They're going to get several images from me, whether it's a paid shoot or not. Anything I sort of edit, I like to give to the models as well, or the client as well.
See, that's cool.
It gives them something to share, and that's how I get spread around.
Yeah. So let's fast forward. The shoot's over. You've got what you think are a good crop of images on the memory card. Yep. What happens at that point? Like what's the ingestion, backup, post-processing workflow? Okay.
So my cameras shoot with 2 cards. One card goes into the card reader, and that gets copied to a hard drive or a RAID, and then it's backed up. And then typically I will open in Lightroom and start to go through the images. And this is normally once the client's left and I've had a shower and cleaned up my gear. Want to make sure that the housing's all nice and serviced. Yeah. So it'll back up, back up all the cards, and then Lightroom to start off with, bring in all the files, and I'll just go I'll go through and start rating the ones I want to work on. And then once I've gone through them all, then I'll start editing. And that'll start off in Lightroom, maybe a little bit of Photoshop to remove some bubbles and things like that. Luminar for some portraiture work. Quite often use the portrait features in Luminar for for working on the faces and things like that. That works really, really well. Photoshop again, and then back to Lightroom, and then export it out.
Wow. Okay.
So that's a very, very condensed workflow, but that for underwater, an image will take a lot longer than a typical landscape that I would take. There's a lot more to do in terms of just the simple color balances and things like that. Even just spot removals, just bubbles. Quite often you'll get a bubble in the wrong spot. So you've got to try and either reconstruct someone's cheek or eye or whatever, or just live with it.
Yeah.
And if you ever see one of my black and white ones, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say. So you're, there's. I know it's depending on the piece that you're working on, but is the idea to make the viewer guess that this shot was done underwater, or do you kind of want them to know that, hey, this model is submerged and yada yada yada? So is there just sort of a general direction you move in, or is it just sort of random?
I'm sort of hoping that they'll figure out that it's underwater. Sometimes I've gone to the time of removing every bubble, and it looks a little bit bizarre because you've got this person and the hair's flowing and the dress might be flowing, and the pose, like we were talking before, they're suspended, and it's I'm not levitating somebody; they're actually in fluid, in water. So I'm hoping that people understand that it's an underwater shot. There's very few that I've done that I would have thought that you can't tell, whether it's because of the environment we're in. I've shot a few times up in Noosa, that's in the Sunshine Coast, about 2 hours north of me, and there's some lovely fairy pools, from the ocean. And I've taken a photo, and when you get back, you can see fish, swimming around at the bottom of the shot. I've even had a few where they started to bite me on my leg, so you've got to be careful of the fish. But I don't have a problem with showing that it's underwater. I think that's all part of it.
Have you ever thought about leaving the pool and doing underwater shots, like your style of underwater shots? But you said you're near the Great Barrier Reef, right? In that area.
Correct. Yeah, I've shot. We've done a couple of family holidays, and we've sort of done a little bit of diving on the Great Barrier Reef or parts of it. And so I've got my kids swimming next to turtles and things like that.
Nice.
And yes, I'd like to introduce a model into something like that. That would be a bigger, elaborate affair. This is probably where I would have a few people there for safety. You see some of these beautiful underwater images, and you've got this lovely, model, draped on a shipwreck and things like that. I'm definitely not up to that level, and I don't have the crew for that, because you definitely need divers with aqualungs to be able to keep people alive. That's the biggest thing, is just making sure people, one, they feel safe, and two, that they have a good time. So my safety brief normally hopefully makes them laugh.
Yeah, the Great Barrier Reef, man. In that area of the ocean, I would think that's there are quite a few things that aren't friendly to humans down there. So
there's a few little bites, but for the most part, they don't bother us. I haven't run into any sharks yet that have annoyed me. The sea turtles, they just do their own thing. The big leatherbacks, they're pretty amazing to watch. Missed out on some manta rays, which is unfortunate, but just another reason to go back.
I'd be afraid of those jellyfish over there. Those we talked about this in the community that you and I are both a member of, the SWIP community. The box jellies that we keep hearing about that are supposedly slightly poisonous. I don't know.
Just a little bit, yeah. No.
Just a little bit.
They will have warnings. And I've actually seen the waves, all of a sudden the sirens will go off, they'll clear the beaches, and you'll see the waves crashing, or the swell in the ocean, and you'll see this cloud of jellyfish going through it.
Oh.
And it's quite a sight.
Oh, yeah. I'm just like, I get that thing in the pit of my stomach just thinking about that, being in the water with thousands of those things around, and only takes one of them, and they're like this big, right?
Oh, a little bit bigger than that, but yeah, they're
like that then.
Yeah. And they do hurt, they do sting, and brown vinegar, I think, is one of the best treatments for it.
Yeah,
I don't think you need to pee on anybody, but brown vinegar is very good.
Hey, I'd be like, if it came to, dying, go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Oh man, that's cool.
We have a few things to worry about down here, but thankfully, I don't think I haven't been stung by a box jellyfish yet.
Good. Let's keep it that way. We need you around, man. We need you around.
Thank you.
So So that's the post-processing side, right? So you've gone through Photoshop, you've removed bubbles, etc., or you've gone through Lightroom, organized, did some color adjustments, I assume. Then you're over in Photoshop, if necessary, removing pixels and bubbles and reconstructing if necessary.
The water jets out of the side of the pool, or the vents or the drains or whatever, stuff like that I don't need, or the odd, I try and keep my pool quite clean, particularly before a shoot. So there's always going to be, I've got quite a lot of trees in my backyard, so there's always going to be a leaf floating around there somewhere. So I just like to clone stuff like that out, just clean up the image as best as possible. Yeah. And then just work on, a few strands of hair or there or whatever. And
then what does the final delivery look like? So you're done, you're happy with this set of images, they're ready to go to the client, or you're ready to share them with the client. What mechanisms or services do you use to share that body of work with the final eyeball?
The final? Yeah. So typically for a paying client, they'll get both a high-res version and a smaller, sometimes watermarked, not usually watermarked, sort of social media size. Because typically most people want to share stuff like this on social media. So I'll send out a high and low res version, typically via Dropbox. So I'll pop it into Dropbox, give them a link, and if they've got any questions, they can always contact me. Or if anything, I get any more images from my session type thing. So normally down the line, I'll go back and revisit an album and find one or two, what I think somehow I missed. We'll work on those and then add that to their folder and just say, look, I've thrown in a couple more images for you. Have a look. My workflow is I typically will deliver to the client or the model. I will let them review them, make sure that there's nothing there that they aren't happy with. And if they're happy with the images, or if there's a couple that they don't particularly like, I'll just remove them, and it's something that I won't share. But normally I'll let the model or the client have a look first, make sure they're happy. And once I've got the go-ahead that they love the images or they're happy with them, then I'll start to use them myself for my portfolio and go from there. I don't think I've had too many that people have said, oh, please don't use that one or whatever. Normally it's a case of they're very happy with the experience.
And give me more, right?
And give me more, correct. Essentially, yeah. So with the workflow in terms of the files, I don't normally batch process too many. There might be one or two that I'll treat the same because they were similar depth and, it might have just, a variation on a pose. But typically I enjoy the editing side, and I'll spend a bit of time on each one, and I'll treat each one differently. So some will be in color, some will be in black and white, and different versions, different crops and things like that. I quite like to occasionally flip them on their side or upside down, so it almost looks like the person's falling out of the water. Just to, again, people to sort of figure out what's going on. Where is this person? What are they doing? And how did I take that? And it's just, I've just rotated at 180 degrees. So there's just messing with people's minds where possible.
Because you can. Why not, right?
Because you can. That's right. It's a photo. We can do stuff.
How do you handle payment? Like I know some of this stuff is, some of the shots that you do or the work you do is free or, trade, etc. But what about payment? If you're just delivering the files through Dropbox, how do you get paid?
Normally I'll request payment beforehand.
Okay.
Or at least a deposit, and just to book in a date or whatever, and we'll go from there. And then before I deliver the final images, I might send them a couple of quick ones and say, look, here's a couple. If you can just, finish payment, and I'll have the rest for you in a day or so's time, or whatever it happens to be. For the underwater work, I haven't had any grief with people not wanting to pay. That's been fairly good, actually. It's more the weddings and things like that where people can be a little bit difficult, and that's why I try to avoid weddings.
yeah. I'm hearing more and more of that. Lots of people. Yeah, that's interesting. But some people love weddings. It's interesting. Some people just really love shooting weddings. Yeah,
I enjoy shooting. I never thought I would, and then I got thrust into it, and an opportunity came up for one of my first weddings, and it's like I can't say no to that. And it was a good trip, but. Typically, I've avoided weddings. I used to sort of enjoy shooting anything but people. But as I've sort of developed as a photographer, the people thing is actually not too bad, particularly when you work with professional models. They make any job a substantially better job.
Absolutely.
It's not hard work when it's with a model. Absolutely. So I'd rather pay for a model than get paid by a grumpy client anytime.
Absolutely. Well, before we wrap this up, Craig, I wanted to get I'm asking guests of this podcast to share like a funny or interesting experience they've had in their genre of photography. So in the underwater photography kind of world, can you think of anything that's kind of pops in your head as like, okay, that was weird or that was funny, etc.?
I can think of one that was a little bit funny, and I don't want it to be too crude, but we talked about before about clothes having a mind of their own. Yeah. And I did have a shoot with two models, and at one stage they had removed some undergarments. They had a dress on, they both had dresses on, but nothing on underneath. And we discussed, that water moves clothing around, so please be modest. I'm not trying to embarrass anybody. And as it turned out, the dress moved completely in the wrong way. And when we got back out, we were looking at the photos, and I was, sorry about that. And they just thought it was the funniest thing in the world. And the model who was exposed, she actually grabbed her phone to take a photo of the back of my camera to send to her boyfriend or whatever. So I thought it was quite funny for me. So it wasn't what I was expecting. I thought they might have been a little bit embarrassed, but no, they weren't.
I gotta imagine there's probably tons of things, because shooting underwater is unpredictable, right? Coming from a novice underwater shooter or a non-shooter, but it seems like just best laid plans. You get under there, and then just things happen, and it's just you let serendipity take over at some point. Is that kind of
well and truly? And the discussion I have with the model leading up to it, particularly if I haven't worked with them before, is look, underwater clothing does move around. I don't want you to be embarrassed in any way. I'm happy shooting whatever you want to shoot. However, if you want to be covered, wear something underneath. Wear a bikini underneath or swimsuit underneath the dress or the outfit or whatever you're wearing. And again, you have final say on what gets shown if something does, something is exposed. So I'm not trying to embarrass a client in any way. I want them to enjoy the experience and do it again. And if they feel comfortable, either nude, topless, fully clothed, that's fine with me. Whatever they feel comfortable with. But yeah, so far so good. Nobody's drowned.
No one's drowned. And you say that with that deadpan, sort of. Yeah, no deaths yet, so it's great. Yeah.
Well, look, part of my safety brief is I tell them they're not allowed to drown because I haven't actually finished the paperwork yet. So until I finish the paperwork, nobody's allowed to drown. So.
Oh yeah, I love it. So what's next on the photography journey for Craig Stampfli?
Next, well, it's coming into our winter now in Australia, in Brisbane, so it's too cold to be jumping in my pool. Looking at another housing for another camera. So I've got options. People keep sending me links to other underwater photographers that do elaborate sets and things like that. So I've got a couple of things in mind. Nothing as big as those. I did have two people, a male and female, that I shot a couple of months ago underwater. And we did some like typical dancing moves. So he was fully dressed in a suit and shoes and everything like that. I had to weigh him down so he could stand at the bottom of the pool. And then I had a beautiful model in a flowing dress, and he's throwing her around and having a bit of fun. So I'll
cool.
expand on that. I'll slowly start to add more and more people to it, a few more props and things like that. I do like the thought of an underwater scene, an underwater set, but that involves a lot of people, and I quite like working sort of just on my own. So
no, absolutely. Yeah. So if people want to contact you or otherwise connect with you, what's a good place for them to do that?
Well, my website's stampfli.photography, and then Instagram it's stampfli.photography or craig.stampfli, either way.
Fantastic.
I think that's the major ways of getting a hold of me, and that's obviously where you can see some of my portfolio and some of my work.
Yeah, and I'll link to all those in the blog post for this episode, as well as in the YouTube video, so people will be able to find you. And you know what your homework is, right? So you have work to do today. Go watch 300. 300. Send me a photo of that scene.
I will. It's 7:00 in the morning now, so I'll make a coffee and then I'll crack open a movie.
There you go. This is Sparta. Perfect.
This is Sparta. Very cool.
All right, Craig Stampfli, man. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
No problem at all. Thanks, man.
Okay, take care. This episode was made possible by our friends at Fujifilm. Make images, share stories, and experience moments at the speed of life with Fujifilm. Thank you for staying home with us.